At the high water line of history, there sits a small country that should not have mattered and did. The Dutch Republic, 8 provinces stitched together against the tide of the Spanish Empire in the long revolt of the 16th century, did not have the population of France or the standing armies of Brandenburg. By 1670, the entire republic contained roughly 2 million people, fewer than lived in London and Paris combined, and about the same as the population of England outside London. But in the 17th century, this small, low-lying country built something the world had never quite seen, and has not seen since, with the same precision: a working financial system. In 1609, the city of Amsterdam founded the Wissel Bank, a public exchange bank that recorded deposits, settled merchant balances, and did so with a stability that bankers 500 miles away in Florence and Genoa could only envy. Amsterdam itself grew, in barely one lifetime, into the 3rd largest city of Europe, near 200,000 souls, packed onto a few square miles of reclaimed polder. By 1637, the Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the VOC, had a market capitalization of roughly 78 million guilders, a figure so large that, adjusting it for the size of the global economy at the time, as economic historians Jan de Vries and Ad van der Voorde have argued in their monumental study, The First Modern Economy, places it among the wealthiest corporations ever assembled. Between 1602 and 1796, the VOC would, by its own ledger, send nearly 1 million Europeans to work in the Asian trade on 4,785 ships, and net for its shareholders more than 2.5 million tons of spices, silk, tea, and fine cloth. The country that would become the Netherlands commercialized shipbuilding and global insurance. Joint stock companies traded in a permanent marketplace that opened at noon and closed only when the bell rang, a press that published in Dutch, French, and Hebrew, and a population so urbanized that 45% of its people lived in cities, while the rest of Europe struggled to keep 10% out of the fields. To stand on the Dam Square in 1670 was to stand at the center of the world economy. The taxes of a republic that did not yet officially exist as a sovereign state were financing wars in the Atlantic and the Baltic. The bond market for Dutch provincial debt had been quoted in continuous prices for almost a century. Looking down, confident. Looking up, brilliant. Looking sideways, not yet worried. But the empires always end, and this one had a beginning of the end, and it rests, of all things, in a single piece of paper. In the spring of 1782, in a plain counting house on the Herengracht Canal in Amsterdam, the firm of Willink and Staphorst set down the precise terms under which the new American Republic could borrow money. The document was not large. It ran to 3 pages of careful Dutch commercial prose, written on the firm's watermarked stock with a quill. It fixed an interest rate at 5%. It secured the loan against anticipated French revenue that would pass through Dutch hands in the course of the war. And it required the signature of the province of Holland, which at that moment was itself so close to financial collapse that the directors signing the paper could hear creditors gathering outside their own doors. John Adams, the American envoy, took the document back to his lodgings, put it in his dispatch case, and wrote his son, John Quincy, a single line that evening that captures more about the end of empires than any book ever has. Why is it, he asked, that the Dutch, who are themselves drowned in debts, are willing to lend money to a country that has nothing? It is a question that historians have spent 2 centuries trying to answer. Tonight, we are going to try to answer it too. To feel the collapse, you have to feel the numbers, because in the end, it is the numbers that break the bones. In 1770, the Dutch Republic still sat, by one careful reckoning, second only to Britain in per capita income. By 1795, it had dropped below France, and in the next decade would drop below most of northwestern Europe. Public debt had done most of the work. Jonathan Israel, whose 1400-page The Dutch Republic, its rise, greatness, and fall as the standard account, traces the cascade with the patience of a coroner. The province of Holland alone carried a debt of roughly 160 million guilders in 1690. By the Peace of Utrecht in 1713, the figure had nearly doubled to almost 300 million guilders, and the debt-to-tax ratio was already over 12 to 1. By the mid-1780s, when the war was being fought and the bills were coming due, the province was servicing a debt equal to roughly 15 times its annual tax receipts, and interest payments alone consumed somewhere between 40 and 50% of every guilder the provincial government could actually bring in, a share so heavy that the regents stopped pretending it could be paid down and began quietly rolling it forward. The Bank of Amsterdam, once the bedrock of the system, had allowed the city authorities to borrow against its own reserves and had quietly inflated its deposits past the real silver in its vault, so that by 1790, the book value of bank money in circulation exceeded the coin the bank could actually hand over by a ratio that some contemporaries estimated at better than 3 to 1, an arrangement the historian Stephen Quinn of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta has described with deliberate restraint as a conservatively run institution that simply chose not to do anything about what its own officials knew to be the case. The United East India Company, the VOC, was on paper still paying 18% annual dividends to its shareholders as late as 1781, 19 years before its official dissolution at the end of 1799. In reality, the dividends were paid out of borrowed money. By 1796, the company owed roughly 119 million guilders and held assets the auditors valued at roughly 62 million guilders net of outstanding debt, a gap so wide that no honest board could have closed it without a confession. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, declared by Britain in December 1780 at the height of the American Revolution and concluded only in the treaties of 1784, after Britain struck first against Dutch shipping with impunity, stripped the Dutch of 26 of their East Indiamen captured in single convoy actions, plus the whole of Ceylon with its harbor at Trincomalee, plus Nigapatnam on the Indian coast, and for a few terrible years, the Cape of Good Hope itself. One economic historian, in just one quiet sentence, says it best. The Republic had begun to fight a war whose bill was larger than its annual revenue, and the bill was being underwritten by a bond market that knew it. That is not a metaphor. That is the death certificate of a state, signed in advance. How did a country that invented modern finance end up unable to count its own money? The answer lives in a man, and the man was born in the wrong place at exactly the right time. He was Johan van der Heim van Duivendijke, a Rotterdam magistrate who rose in the 1780s to lead the Patriot movement, the same movement that wanted to drag the House of Orange out of politics and replace it with a more genuinely civic republic. Van der Heim was the kind of provincial regent who kept ledger books in his head and a copy of Montesquieu in his saddlebag. In private correspondence, he sketched with the earnest precision of a man drawing up his own will what a reformed Dutch constitution would look like, and argued forcefully that the regent class had ceased to deserve the trust that the credit market kept extending to it on habit rather than on inspection. He knew long before Alexis de Tocqueville said it about small aristocracies lodged inside democracies that such aristocracies mistake their privileges for principles and their ledgers for the truth. He also knew, because he had traded bills in Amsterdam and read Cicero carefully, that credit is in the end a confidence trick. It works only as long as the people you owe decide to keep believing you. When the French army crossed the Dutch frontier in the winter of 1794, and the ice on the great rivers could hold the weight of an invading column, Van der Heim's younger colleague, Rutger Jan Schimmelpenninck, not yet the constitutional draftsman he would become, but already a brilliant Amsterdam lawyer with a practice that touched half the merchant banks in the city, took it upon himself to run the finances of his city through the crisis. He froze the warrants that the Whistle Bank held against the bankrupt province of Holland. He refused to honor the interest coupons that came due in the first weeks of the French occupation. Then he sat in his own parlor across a table by candlelight from bankers who could no longer pay their own clerks, and he negotiated the survival of a city by promising things that the city's books could not yet cover. The man who would, 12 years later, hand Napoleon Bonaparte the cleanest financial administration in occupied Europe had first learned how empires break, because he had to keep the vault lights on while the doors were being kicked in. The negotiation everyone remembers took place in the same city, in the same decade, and involved none of those men. It involved a New England lawyer in a powdered wig, with a vocabulary that offended his hosts and a resolve that did not. John Adams arrived at The Hague in the summer of 1780, carrying letters from the Continental Congress, and a problem that no one in America could solve. The new country was broke. Its paper Continental was trading at roughly 1/40th of its face value on the Amsterdam Exchange. Its soldiers were unpaid. Adams was sent, in his own acid summary later in life, to beg for money from a republic that was, in principle, the lender of last resort to the world. He was refused politely by the States General, which feared exactly the kind of British retaliation that was already assembling in the Channel. He was refused, less politely, by Willink, Staphorst, and the other Amsterdam houses who remembered what had just happened in 1772, when the British credit crisis, centered on the implosion of the Air Bank in Edinburgh, had been transmitted across the North Sea in a matter of weeks. By Christmas of 1772, it had hit Amsterdam directly. The ancient house of Clifford and Sons, the very model of a respectable London merchant bank, had gone down with liabilities that pulled Herman and Johann van Seppenwolde, Abraham ter Borch, and the Amsterdam house of Peter Steen under the water with them, in a chain reaction so swift that the New York Federal Reserve's Liberty Street Economics Group has since called it the first true global credit crisis. Adams's bankers were still waist-deep in those losses, and they would not let a single commitment leave their desks without collateral that could actually be delivered. So Adams did what Dutch regents had done to each other for 200 years. He went around the formal capitals. He sat in private parlors on the Keizersgracht. He drank wine with the directors whose grandfathers had signed the Wachter Charter that started the Whistle Bank. He came to the table with one argument that America's enemies had not yet managed to answer in a way that would satisfy a man who priced bills for a living. The war, he said, was about to destroy the British system of Atlantic trade, and the only power on earth positioned to inherit that system was the Dutch, but only if they had a counterparty in the new American state, a counterparty that would, by the law of finance, eventually become a customer. On the evening of May the 17th, 1782, Willink and Staphorst set their names to the loan. 5 million guilders, 5% interest. Repayment guaranteed by Dutch expectation of French money. Adams described the dinner in his diary in language that reads more like a confession than a celebration. The bankers, he wrote, are in no small degree of distress for money. He signed anyway. They signed anyway. The Treaty of Amity and Commerce followed in October, and the Dutch Republic became, in the most literal financial sense, the midwife of the United States. Now, the second thread. It does not appear at first to have anything to do with the affair on the Herengracht. In the year 1602, when the VOC was founded at the initiative of the land's advocate Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the Dutch also founded, almost by accident, a gadget called a joint stock company with permanent capital and limited liability for its shareholders. It is worth pausing on this because no one, including the directors who signed the charter, fully understood what they had done. Limited liability meant that a person who put money into the company could lose only what he actually put in. Not his house, not his daughter's dowry, not his workshop, not the silver plate in his cabinet. This was, at the time, an act of almost incomprehensible leniency to strangers, and it took about 190 years for the consequences to come due. In 1796, the company's directors discovered what joint stock limited liability actually meant when applied to insolvency on a national scale. The state could seize the VOC's warehouses in Amsterdam, its warehouses in Batavia, its fleets, its forts, its ledger books. But it could not seize the houses of the speculators who had bought the shares in 1781 at the 18% dividend and rode them down to nothing. Worse, the state discovers that the same trade clubs that had handled VOC paper for 2 centuries, the Amsterdam brokers who had set up the world's first permanent formal stock exchange on its own dedicated bridge, had already moved most of the liquid capital out of the country, in pieces small enough to evade the exchange controls the Patriots tried to impose in the last weeks before the French occupation. By 1795, when the French armies arrived to make permanent what the winter of 1794 had only threatened, the major shareholders had already transferred their holdings into British funds, into Prussian mortgage bonds, into French assignats, and into a small but growing market in the new American federal debt that Alexander Hamilton had begun issuing in 1790, almost a decade earlier, with the very familiar design behind it. Hamilton had studied the Whistle Bank and its surviving correspondence, had studied the Bank of England, had concluded that a federal republic could not survive without a national institution that could clear payments, finance a national debt, and stand between the Treasury and the panic of every market morning. The Amsterdam bankers who lost their shirts in 1796 were, in part, the same Amsterdam bankers whose grandchildren would lend the United States, at slightly better terms and through slightly safer institutions, the money to dig the Erie Canal and to fund the Louisiana Purchase. That circle on its own would be a curiosity. But it becomes a pattern the moment you notice who taught whom and how the lesson was paid for. The contradiction, the one that makes the story worth telling, is this. The Dutch Republic invented almost every meaningful institution of modern capitalism: public central banking in the form of the Whistle Bank, double-entry bookkeeping at sovereign scale, which Simon Schama argues shaped not just the ledgers, but the moral imagination of the burghers who kept them, joint stock companies with tradable shares, organized futures and options markets, the first real financial press, with daily price lists that anyone with a guilder could buy at the corner bookshop, and an entire legal architecture of bills, notes, and endorsements that English bankers would spend the next 2 centuries importing, improving, and on quiet evenings pretending was entirely their own invention. The Dutch Republic invented, in other words, the machine of modern finance, and it ran the machine until the machine ate its owner. The Whistle Bank did not fail because it was poorly designed. It failed because the city of Amsterdam borrowed against the silver in its own vault, year after year, to keep paying soldiers and to keep paving canals it could no longer afford. The VOC did not fail because it was poorly managed from the top. It failed because it preferred to borrow to pay dividends instead of telling its shareholders the plain and embarrassing truth about the conduct of its Asian governors. The directors at the Cape had spent 2 generations taking bribes from the very burghers whose freebooting the company was supposed to police. The boards in Amsterdam had spent the same 2 generations declining to open the relevant ledgers. The Republic did not lose the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War because its ships were slow. It lost the war because its admirals had spent the same 2 generations filling out invoices that did not, on close inspection, add up. The crisis was not an act of God. It was the bill, presented for an earlier bill, and the second twist inside the contradiction, which is the one that should make every modern auditor slightly uncomfortable, is this. The system that the Dutch invented kept working long after the Dutch stopped running it. Britain ran it, haltingly, from 1815 to 1914. The United States has run it with quiet interruptions from 1945 onward. As Schama wrote in The Embarrassment of Riches, the Dutch built the cultural and financial grammar of the modern bourgeois world, and then forfeited the right to speak that grammar in the only language their creditors ever bothered to listen to. They became the stenographers of a system they themselves had designed. And that was the deepest wound of all. Afterward, the cost was paid in ways that history textbooks do not always say aloud. When the Batavian Republic, the French client state installed after the collapse of the old order, formally nationalized the VOC on the 1st of March 1796, it assumed not only the company's warehouses and ships, but also its debts. And it discovered that the debts amounted to roughly 119 million guilders against assets it valued, on a sober audit. At just over 62 million guilders, even after discounting everything that could not be moved off Asian docks before the British returned. The company was allowed to die quietly on the last day of 1799. Its charter lapsed. Its shareholders received nothing of substance. Its pensioners, the retired sailors and widows who held small VOC bonds as their retirement savings, were promised compensation in the new Batavian currency, which almost immediately collapsed under the weight of the war it was being printed to pay for. They received, in real terms, a fraction of what they had been promised, and waited decades in some cases for even that. The Cape Colony, which had been seized by the Royal Navy in 1781 as part of the opening moves of the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, was not returned to Dutch control in the final settlement until 1814, and only then as a piece of the post-Napoleonic game at the Congress of Vienna, not as a restoration of Dutch power. The Indonesian archipelago, the part that actually mattered commercially, stayed in Dutch hands, but only because Napoleon fell from grace before the British could keep it, and the price of keeping it would be paid, very quietly, for the next 150 years. The Republic itself ceased to exist as an independent state in 1810, absorbed whole into Napoleon's empire, and emerged from the Congress of Vienna in 1815 as a kingdom under the House of Orange, smaller, quieter, and considerably more polite. The cultural effect was subtler and arguably worse. A country that had been constitutionally open about money, in which the burgher class had been allowed to print pamphlets about the Bank of Amsterdam without being jailed for the trouble, gradually learned to be silent about money. By the late 19th century, the Dutch had become, in the wry observation that economic historians still repeat with affection, a nation of small savers and silent bankers, careful, prudent, and present at every great financial moment of the next century, including the founding of the Federal Reserve in 1913 in a country whose founders had openly studied the Wisselbank as a model, but never again the senior partner. The bill took a long time to come due. Then it came due, the country paid it, and learned to keep its mouth shut about how the bill had run up in the first place. I want to be careful here, because the temptation with this kind of story is to draw a clean line from Amsterdam in 1796 to Washington in 2026, and the clean line would be a lie. The United States in the 21st century is not the Dutch Republic in the 18th. Its economy is, by most responsible measures, the largest single national economy the modern world has ever seen, more than 3 times the size of its nearest rival in nominal terms. Its debt, although large in absolute number, is denominated in a currency that roughly half the world still settles its trade in, and that almost every central bank, including the Nederlandsche Bank across the street from the rebuilt Beurs van Hendrik de Keyser, still treats as the ultimate reserve asset. Its central bank, the Federal Reserve, was deliberately modeled in 1913 on a fusion of the Wisselbank and the Bank of England, with explicit attention paid to what had gone wrong in 1796, and it does not, so far as the public record discloses, allow itself to borrow against its own vault to pay a senator's pension or to underwrite a colonial war it cannot afford. The United States also benefits from things that the Dutch Republic never had. A steady current of younger workers, drawn from any continent it chooses to draw them from. A continent of internal markets that no foreign power can starve out. And a military balance that has, since 1945, made it the de facto guarantor of every sea lane on which global commerce moves, including the very sea lanes the Dutch used to make their own merchants rich. A straight collapse in the American style of 1780 would require a series of failures that no responsible analyst today is openly forecasting, and it would require, more importantly, a willingness among the country's own insiders to keep telling the same small lie for 2 generations in a row, which is a thing that financial history, as Charles Kindleberger reminds us with weary repetition, generally does not produce on schedule, though it does, on average, keep producing it eventually. So I will not draw the straight line, but I will draw the curve. The commentators who repeat, in different accents, that this time is different are not wrong when they say it. They are wrong only when they say it without the rest. The Dutch Republic was the richest, the most financially sophisticated, the most institutionally complete state in Europe for the better part of 150 years. And the people who destroyed it were not foreign invaders, foreign navies, or foreign central bankers. They were its own regents, its own directors, its own city magistrates, its own shareholders, all of whom decided, generation after generation, to borrow a little more against the silver in the vault, to pay a dividend a little higher than the trade could bear, to underwrite one more colonial war than the revenue could comfortably stand, to overlook one more burgher who was lining his pockets at the Cape, to roll over one more interest payment into a new note whose principal they had no real plan ever to retire. Empires, financial ones emphatically included, do not die from external shocks alone. They die when their own insiders decide, slowly and in unison, that the cost of telling the truth to the next creditor, in the next quarter, on the next page of the next audit, is higher than the cost of borrowing to postpone the telling. Kindleberger, in Manius, Panics and Crashes, placed the Dutch Republic at the head of his list of the great bubbles of recorded history. He was right about the tulip. He was, in retrospect, even more right about everything that came after it. The tulip was the parable. The death of the Whistle Bank was the bill. If there is a single lesson that travels, by slow freight, from the Herengracht in 1782 to the marble halls of any modern treasury, including the ones that the Dutch themselves still keep open on the Frederiksplein, it is this: the institutions of credit are stronger than any single borrower, but only as long as those institutions are treated, by the people who run them, as if the people who use them will eventually read the footnotes. The Dutch invented modern finance, and then they invented modern financial decline by using their own invention to avoid the most basic test of any financial system ever devised, which is whether the people running it can sit across a table from a creditor, look him in the eye, and tell the truth about the silver that is and is not in the vault behind them. The United States did not invent modern finance. It inherited it and refined it and exported it. Through the swap lines, the Federal Reserve quietly extended to the European Central Bank and the Nederlandsche Bank in the cold weeks of October 2008, through the dollar clearing that settles a contract in Jakarta before lunch in New York, and through the legal infrastructure of the euro-dollar market that was, in a literal and slightly inconvenient sense, invented in London by bankers who had once trained in Rotterdam and who still keep, in private, the ledgers their teachers left behind. The Dutch Republic is gone as a great power. Its central bank still operates a building on the Frederiksplein in Amsterdam that sits across the street from one of the world's busiest financial districts. The patient ghost of one of its own 17th century merchants is, faintly and embarrassingly, still in the room. And the bill, as the bill always does, is still very quietly in the mail. If you want to go deeper, the place to start is not a 17-page treaty of 1782. Start with Anne Goldgar's Tulip Mania, which will quietly and permanently change what you think you know about the most famous bubble of all. Then read Jonathan Israel's The Dutch Republic, which is 1,400 pages long and worth every single one. Simon Schama's The Embarrassment of Riches is the cultural version. De Vries and van der Woude's The First Modern Economy is the dataset. Charles Kindleberger's Manias, Panics, and Crashes is the manual. If you want to tell me which other empire you think the curve fits next, drop the name in the comments, and we will build the case carefully and with footnotes. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. The bill always comes due. The only question every single time is who signs it.